everybody. Welcome to the first in a series of 7 webinars in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I'm Frances Littman, the founder of the Creatively United for the Planet nonprofit society and your host for this week. I'd first like to acknowledge we are hosting this webinar on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people here on beautiful Vancouver Island, for whom we give thanks for this privilege and their stewardship from time eternal. We have much to learn. On behalf of Creatively United and our EarthFest partners, John O'Riordan of the Gail O'Riordan Climate and the Arts Legacy Series and the Wildwood Ecoforest Institute Society, we welcome you all from near and far on this international webinar. Now, I can't even begin to do justice to Bob Sandford's impressive resume, but I can tell you he is an extremely accomplished and interesting individual whose accelerated journey began at age 20 when he survived a life-changing fall into a glacial crevasse that has since led him to become an award-winning author and editor of over 35 books. Here's just a few. This one's just a beauty. This is a life work I know for Bob. Just to give you a sense, one of his more recent books, Quenching the Dragon, Hard Work of Hope, Ethical Water, and like 35 more. At the rate you're going, Bob, there'll be even more than that. So Bob is also the 20-year chair of water and climate security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health, and acts as a senior advisor on water issues for a global public policy forum comprised of more than 30 former heads of state. Bob and his wife Vi, who happens to be a municipal councillor, are long-term residents of Canmore, Alberta. Bob told me he considers today's presentation to be one of the most important talks he has given in his entire career. Let's find out why. Welcome, Bob Sandford.
Well, thank you very much, Frances. And I think this is one of the most difficult and important presentations in my life, in that it does not concentrate on a speculative crisis that we've long held we will face in the coming decades, but aims at dealing with compound immediate-term dangers, not to just some regions, but to the entire world. Please allow me first to acknowledge what an honor it is to be invited to speak at the outset of this important week as part of this remarkable new webcast. And please allow me to begin by extending to each of you the very best wishes of the United Nations, wherever you are. And in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I wish to acknowledge from the outset that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures, which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And it's to the common heritage of all of humanity that I wish to direct my remarks today. First, allow me, please, to begin by explaining my work. The foundation of my work with the UN is science. And it seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to 2. Tell the truth and stand up for all humanity and for the planet now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world. It is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. And I wish to offer that there has probably never been a time in history when it's been more important to understand what science is telling us about the dangerous disconnect between our current societal direction and a sustainable future. The most immediate risk at the moment is that our society will lapse into some different but still functionally unaltered version of what we had before the pandemic, which would be a disaster leading only to the next disasters. The world won't be and shouldn't be the same again. As I hope to demonstrate in today's webinar, our interest should reside in not recreating the world we had, but rather in creating the world we want and the world we need to have if we are to perpetuate tolerable living conditions for ourselves and for the rest of life on this planet in the future. This presentation is an invitation to imagine the world we want for yourself. But I should put you on notice that, consistent with the urgencies of our time, this presentation is not, as John O'Riordan would put it, for the faint of heart. COVID-19 has stopped society in its tracks. The pandemic has created what I hope history will remember as the Great Pause. We are grounded until we get grounded. And the premise of this presentation is that while it will be crucial to ensure we're better protected from future pandemics, that we can't stop there. We must use this extraordinary hiatus to thoughtfully consider how we can perpetuate our gains in carbon emissions reductions, while at the same time making other critically needed changes to our economies and lifestyle expectations that will make us not just less vulnerable to pandemics in the future, but will bolster meaningful, persistent action in achieving the goals of the United Nations 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Agenda. And there's great urgency here. We need to change the direction we are going in time to ensure we never come this close to crossing the threshold of societal collapse again. So please allow me to say what an honor it is to be invited to speak as part of your community's Earth Week activities. Your invitation closes something of a circle for me, in that I participated in the first Earth Day in 1970, where I took this photograph of an environmental demonstration held in downtown Calgary. I have to say that that was a heady time. While overshadowed by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, singers like Joni Mitchell, Gordon Lightfoot, and John Prine were already defining the values that we needed to have. And it's interesting to track now our progress nationally and globally over the first 50 years since that first Earth Day. There was real action for the first 20 years. In fact, it would not be an exaggeration to say that between 1970 and about 1990, Canada was recognized as a world leader in addressing environmental issues such as acid rain, water quality issues in the Great Lakes, and the reduction of chlorofluorocarbon effects on upper atmospheric ozone depletion. We were also greatly respected for how we managed our inland waters, for expanding our national park system, and also for our broader protected areas strategies. Globally, there was talk about meaningful action to stave off the linked threats to the stability of the Earth system posed by the diminishment of global biodiversity and rapid climate change. The UN created global conventions to combat deforestation, desertification, and biodiversity loss, and the UN created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Though the link between biodiversity decline and climate stability had not yet been fully recognized, it looked like the world was heading in the right direction. Then, suddenly, things changed, big time. How much changed can be characterized in the answer to this question? How can it be that rather than being reduced by the 60% over what was being generated in 1990 that was called for then, global carbon dioxide emissions have risen by 30% since the world signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. Here's part of what happened. In 1977, scientists in the employ of Exxon explained to their top executives that there was already a clear scientific consensus that the global climate was already warming as a consequence of burning of fossil fuels. In 1982, Exxon supported climate research and energy transition. Exxon's own scientists projected warming of 2 degrees to as much as 10 degrees Celsius in the coming century. Exxon's executives knew and understood the effects well enough to raise the decks on their offshore drilling rigs because they knew that sea levels were rising, and to begin planning for an Arctic drilling season to expand from 2 to 5 months. Exxon also knew how much warming could be blamed on them. They also knew that the cost of inattention and inaction would be a continued rise in the Keeling curve. For a brief time, it looked like the world was going to deal with the climate crisis. But then Exxon's then president and CEO, Lee Raymond, decided it was better for business if climate change didn't exist. The science isn't settled, he said. As it turned out, that wasn't just a harmless fib, it was a great big fat lie, but that's just the start. Exxon and other big companies and major car manufacturers went on to create the Global Climate Coalition to perpetuate the lie, hiring former tobacco lobbyists to lead the charge. Exxon also created and funded false fronts like the Heartland Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the Cato Institute to spread the lie. The Wall Street Journal also helped. 95% of what it published on climate change disagreed with the 97% consensus of scientists. The rest of the oil industry was happy to put up with that lie and do their very best to help spread it. And it worked. More carbon has been released into the global atmosphere since 1989 than in the rest of the entire history of civilization. Exxon and friends were so good at telling the lie that it took 30 years to see how the lie started and how it was perpetuated. Exxon, in effect, won and changed the course of earthly reality. In those 30 years, however, we have gone from projecting what is going to happen with respect to climate disruption to trying to explain what is already happening and what is happening right in front of our eyes now. We now face nothing less than a planetary emergency. The Exxon lie has proven to be a threat to our future existence. How does Lee Raymond atone for that? How does Exxon find redemption? How can, one might ask, one be absolved of a crime against all of humanity? But it wasn't just corporations, however, that were complicit in this. Over the last 20 years, there have been times when the federal government has almost been completely irresponsible in terms of matters related to the environment. At the provincial level also, there was a subtle but ultimately fundamental shift in the mandate of environmental ministries, where in the 1970s, environment ministries were committed to environmental protection. By the 1990s, the focus had become environmental assurance instead. And that meant that instead of protecting the environment for its own sake, it was now the role of environment ministries to find appropriate ways to mitigate the impacts of approved resource extraction and other developments. In other words, government gave the environment to the free market to take care of. And modeled after the Alberta example, environment, not surprisingly, became subsidiary to energy and development at both provincial and federal levels. By 1995, it was clear that the movement towards smaller governance would also have a profound and purposeful impact on the country's environmental agenda. And you could see this mass abdication coming from miles away. The federal government began downloading weakened environmental responsibilities to the provinces. Provincial governments began downloading responsibility to the municipalities, and financially beleaguered municipalities began downloading their environmental responsibilities to citizen groups and individual volunteers like those on this call. So 50 years after the first Earth Day, we can see where all that slick political sleight of hand and public relations spin has left us. What were once local environmental problems, like oil spills in the 1970s, became regional problems. What were regional problems like habitat loss and surface and groundwater contamination and eutrophication are now national problems. And what were national problems such as biodiversity loss, air and water pollution have grown respectively to become a serious threat to fundamental biodiversity-based planetary life support system function, of which the global climate threat is only one of many alarming expressions. While we have made significant progress in food production, raised the quality of life for many, improved public health widely, and increased human lifespan, all of these gains have come at a cost. And it's not unreasonable to suggest that in many ways, we were closer to accepting and addressing threats to the stability of the Earth system and the causes of global warming 50 years ago than we are now. And while it may have been fine to say that we didn't need to worry about protecting the environment because we'll fix whatever mistakes we make, the problem is that we didn't do that. Look at the oil sands, look at global habitat loss, look at what the climate is doing here and globally. Environmental assurance has proven to be a disaster. Now, because of the pandemic, we're forced to ask ourselves three pressing questions. What do we do now? What do we do next? And where's the hope? So let's look first at where we were and how far we've come in the last 50 years. There were 3.7 billion people on Earth in 1970. This morning, there were nearly 7.8 billion. Of the 9 Earth system boundaries we have established that we cannot cross if we want to ensure safe operation of the Earth system and conditions on this planet which we can survive and in which we can still prosper, we've already crossed 4. Global deforestation and soil degradation, desertification and biodiversity loss are happening faster than we can keep up. We are on track to lose up to 1 million of the other forms of life with whom we share existence on this planet. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere was 325 parts per million in 1970. This morning it was 415 parts per million. Despite international agreements, carbon dioxide emissions continue to rise. The emissions gap between the pledges and a 2 degrees Celsius outcome is presently roughly equivalent to the combined emissions of China and the United States in 2017. With President Trump reversing America's commitment to greenhouse gas emissions reduction, this gap is set to become larger. And if President Trump has his way, not even a pandemic will stop that from happening. Meanwhile, climate change continues to accelerate, as it will continue to do. Because of the amount of heat energy in the climate system, sheltering and distancing measures associated with the pandemic will not slow the acceleration of hydroclimatic change. And in addition, 2 huge new worries have also emerged. Because of accelerated permafrost thaw, parts of the Arctic have gone from being a major carbon sink to becoming a carbon source. And of equal concern is the fact that the world's tropical forests, once like the Arctic, one of the world's most important carbon sinks, have gone from being sinks to sources. And of equal concern is ocean acidification. Besides being the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, this is also the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations. The UN now faces a crisis unparalleled since World War II. And even before the pandemic, the UN warned that we were on the threshold of the unthinkable. Climate change, if not addressed, had already been identified as a threat that could, in the very near term, bring about global economic, social, and political disruption, and in some regions, the specter of societal collapse. So what should we do? Well, perhaps the first thing we should be thinking about in terms of what we should do now is this. Pandemic or not, we must recognize and finally admit that we simply can't go on as we have and use this hiatus to make vital changes to prevent us from coming this close to the threshold of global system and societal collapse ever again. We need clearly to move the debate and understanding of future possibilities beyond a set of economic or technological choices to matters of justice and equity. So what are the steps that we need to take to do that? Well, some of the steps are quite obvious. We know where this and at least some of the other viruses like it come from, and we need to get rid of those breeding grounds. The practice of trade in wildlife and the existence of so-called wet markets anywhere in the world and all that voodoo potion nonsense, illegal trade and medical quackery associated with them has to be terminated immediately. Enforcement enhanced and jail terms for non-compliance made mandatory everywhere. Despite clear and repeated warnings, the pandemic caught us flat-footed. Our collective responses have been all over the map. What we are experiencing now could be jokingly described as the Al Capone School of Public Policy. Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. But there are other lessons here also. The existence of bacteria, viruses, and a host of plasmids and phages predates the evolution of multicellular life by more than 2 billion years. And they can directly fast track the exchange of whole packages of genetic materials through sexless transmission. And we learned all about this with the Ebola virus, which we now know has been hiding deep in African rainforests in one form or another for at least 500 million years. And there's a lesson here that relates to biodiversity loss. The more we push into and against remaining ancient natural systems, the more often we can expect to come face to face with lethal, longer running evolutionary trajectories. And we need to know and respond to that. We also have to pay attention now to protecting our democracies. One of the things we'll undoubtedly need to address as a fundamental vulnerability during this pandemic is the potential rise of demagoguery. Addressing global threats like climate heating demands coherent, unified global governance, but the prospects for achieving such solidarity are not good, nor are the prospects good at the moment for the global situation to sort itself out anytime soon. So if you've worked internationally or in politics, as I'm sure many listeners on this webinar have, you might have observed that the absence of solidarity does not come about by accident. We are ungovernable in large measure because again and again, we allow political leaders to continue to divide us rather than bringing us together in ways that will allow us to address common societal threats and create a better world for the future. A divided and polarized electorate is a perfect mechanism for sustaining the status quo. Conflicted politicians, paid climate change deniers, and skeptics in the employ of covertly weaponized philanthropic organizations masking as legitimate democratic institutions are already jockeying for control of the post-pandemic political world. There are also interests out there that are already working to steal our future from us when the pandemic is over. This would be a good time to be reminded that when we allow ourselves to take up an interest or be distracted from the truth by matters of dubious meaning or value concocted by tyrants and propagandists whose goal it is to create exceptionalism and permanent emergency, when we allow that to happen, we are preparing and participating in the demolition of our own political order. Facts remain facts. While you can manipulate the rhetoric all you want, you can't manipulate the virus or deny the blunt and humbling lessons that one way or another we will learn from the pandemic. There are at least 3 ways that this could fall out. The pandemic could just be a blip and we go back to what we had and just do what we were doing all over again. Or the world will become chaotic and break down. Or people who want hope will use this moment as a pathway to a more just, safer, and meaningfully sustainable world. Now, I don't know about you, but it occurs to me that we have little choice but to choose the latter. For if we don't, the way we are heading, there may not be a world in the future, at least one we recognize and that most of us will be around to witness. We know what to do. Now we have to do it. We have to elect political representatives that not only get it, but get it done. This will require fierce and relentless citizenship. I'm always asked this, what can one person do? Well, stop being one person. We have to stop being apathetic, indifferent, and polite and call things what they really are. We can no longer simply stand by when the widening gap between the real and the ideal, between promise and practice, calls into question either the morality, moral authority, or leadership legitimacy of our politicians and corporate leaders. This is a time to stand up personally for what we believe in, and I'm going to do that. In the province in which I live, our premier has used the pandemic as a smokescreen for investing billions of dollars the people of the province don't have into a bitterly opposed pipeline that will transport presently worthless dirty oil to where it can be burned elsewhere. Shouldn't we be asking this? Are decisions like this in the interests of our common good? We have to wake up to the crimes against our common future that are being committed in our name now, such as the halting of requirements for environmental reporting or adhering to environmental regulations. We have to believe our own eyes and listen carefully, not just to what others tell us, but to what we know is true. There are thousands of orphaned and abandoned oil wells in Alberta alone. Didn't the law say that they had to be capped and remediated before they were abandoned? Then why, then, is the Canadian public now paying for that remediation? As Bob Ray has pointed out, COVID-19 is not so much a leveler as it is a revealer. We need to restore trust in truth. Barely 1% of remediation of the tar sands has been completed to agreed upon standards. Does anyone really think that even with slowly rising oil prices, a faltering fossil fuel industry is actually going to do that remediation? Who will make them? Or will a nearly bankrupt Alberta and the rest of Canada simply accept that we are going to end up with the largest environmental super site on the planet? So, to the second question, what do we do next? Well, there's plenty to do. Significant financial resources are going to be required if we want to make a just transition to renewable energy possible. What may be needed is a super fund dedicated to such a transition. Resources to create such a fund can be freed up by committing the full extent of carbon tax revenues to a just transition socially and a technological transition to renewable energy sources. But the carbon tax, or any carbon tax, is of little use unless we get rid of subsidies. The resources needed to finance a just transition can be made available by eliminating existing fossil fuel subsidies and directing those resources to creating the future we want. And I should point out that the subsidies that we're talking about here are not insubstantial. In 2019, the International Monetary Fund estimated fossil fuel subsidies for 191 countries. Globally, subsidies were calculated to be $4.7 trillion in 2017. And get this, this works out to about $10 million a minute, more than the total amount of the world's governments would spend on health that year. So how are we doing in Canada? Though exact numbers are hard to come by because of the general disregard for transparency, a 2018 report by Overseas Development Institute estimated that annual direct subsidies to the fossil fuel sector in Canada amounted to approximately $6.3 billion in 2016, which amounted to nearly 1/5 of the federal budget at that time. Activities such as the purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline had since added more to that estimate. And in the meantime, it has become clear that funding climate heating is not good business. Globally, oil and gas producers are estimated to have lost $400 billion in market value in the 4 years preceding the pandemic. And these estimates do not include the losses in value this year for which numbers are not yet available. So in other words, we're throwing our prosperity away by lifelining oil companies instead of moving toward a just transition for the fossil fuel industry, for their workers, and by not addressing the climate threat. During the great pause, we might do well to remind ourselves also of the history of the human journey that led us to how we live today. Climate change has always been to a varying extent with us. And while on one hand, it has helped us arrive at where we are today, On the other, it has always been a potential threat multiplier. For thousands of years, climate change has been bringing down civilizations already weakened by unsustainable agricultural practices, ineffective or corrupt governments, unstable economies, unaffordable wars, and by populations that made themselves vulnerable by their ever-increasing numbers to famine and ever-present recurring disease outbreaks. So does that sound in any way familiar? Remember, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that there was a lot of talk about the end of history. Well, it doesn't appear that history is going to end anytime soon, except there's one big difference between the challenges we faced in the past and those we face now. Until the pandemic appeared, we were collectively releasing 200 times the amount of carbon dioxide released by land and seabed volcanic activity, qualifying humanity as the founding member of its own Anthropocene. The rate of climate heating is presently 30 times faster than when the Earth and our evolving species emerged from the most recent ice age. It has been projected that at 4 degrees of warming, the Earth will have a carrying capacity of only 1 billion people. Now that would be the return of history, bigly. Another thing we should be doing is paying attention to the climate threats that may present themselves this summer. Think of what you've seen and witnessed in the last 5 years. 4 of the last 5 years have been flood and fire years. In Western Canada, the summer of 2016 was hot, dry, and smoky. And from an atmospheric perspective, 2017 proved to be the hottest on record without the presence of an El Nino. On May 3rd, 2017, floods hit southern Quebec following excessive rainfall. Some 2,400 houses were flooded and 2,700 people forced from their homes. In total, 146 municipalities were impacted. That same year, a wildfire season 78 days longer than in 1970 ignited the Pacific Northwest, the Sierras, the city of Los Angeles, and much of Western United States and Canada. Breaking 100-year records, BC suffered the largest burn area in its history, nearly 1.2 million hectares, with the largest number of evacuees, 45,000 people, and the largest single fire ever recorded in the province. A state of emergency declared on July 7th was extended 3 times until September 1st. That same year, the US experienced hurricanes of a duration and intensity and rainfall never experienced before. You may remember that the hot and deadly summer of 2018 began in Canada with a rapid melt of near record snowpacks in the Mountain West. The rapid melt caused flooding in parts of British Columbia and exceptionally high early and high flows in rivers draining from the Rockies as the summer's heat came on early. Then came the heat waves. During the week of July 5th, 2018, all-time heat records were set not just in the Northern Hemisphere, but around the world. Since 1980, there has been a 50-fold increase in the number of deadly heat waves globally, with a bigger increase to come. And it's also very important to recognize that there's a direct connection between water and its diametric and symbolic opposite. Again, if you don't have water, as I've said, you get fire. And on any given day, there are now between 10,000 and 30,000 wildfires burning on the planet. We are at the epicenter of an age of fire. In 2018, evidence came from across Europe and Asia. Fires, drought, and floods were everywhere, and was impossible seemed to be happening all at once around the world. After a succession of record hot summers in Europe and elsewhere, it was found in 2019 that the high mountain ranges of the world, including those here in Canada, are now warming as fast as the Arctic. And what we've surmised over the past 5 years is this. We are now witnessing events that are almost outside the calculus of probability. Working with some of the best climate scientists in the world in 2019, the evidence suggested we may have done what we didn't want to do, and that is to cross an invisible threshold into a new and very dangerous climate regime in the Northern Hemisphere. So that makes it necessary to ask a question no one wants or dares at this tragic moment to ask. Can you imagine what it would be like if we are visited by these kinds of catastrophes at the peak of the COVID pandemic? So, to the last question, where's the hope? Well, the future is not someplace we go, it's something we make together. As they say in Africa, tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today. Hope resides in thinking past this pandemic and imagining just the return of the world as we knew it with all its inherent risks, but a transformation and the creation of a world we want, the world we need. And contrary to what some think, not everything has to change. Many human qualities, such as the capacity for compassion, cooperation, and altruism, serve us well always. But to create a better world, we have to see the great pause as a transformation of all life on Earth. And to that end, we have created a collaboration to determine for ourselves, in our own words, what we collectively think must be improved. The areas in which those who have chosen to accept the invitation to participate include such topics as the transformation of energy, economy, and finance, technological innovation, poverty, global equality and human rights, and planning for the post-pandemic social order. The topics covered in this collaboration also embrace nature's rights and environmental ethics in a post-pandemic reality, faith and religion, as well as reconciliation with Indigenous people. The collaboration is also exploring, through the program of which I'm part today, how art, music, and culture can help bring about the creation of the world we want. But at the moment, we have concluded that there are 4 critical things that have to change immediately. Now, you can create your own list, but this, for the moment, is ours. We need a new economic model and social fabric. We need to put Earth system restoration ahead of relentless economic growth as a societal priority, and we need to do that now. We need to see this pandemic as a dress rehearsal for the threat climate change is poised to pose. And finally, we need to use the UN's 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Goals as a blueprint for global reset and the future of hope. We have before us a moment during which we can turn this great pause and the catastrophe that caused it into an opportunity for global reset and the emergence of new hope for the future. But to make that transformation, we have to act on behalf of that hope. The mobilization of hope is a precondition of effective action. And the first thing we need to realize that if we are to address the climate threat in time, we need reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation, first with one another and at the same time with the earth. We now know what Indigenous people have known and been telling us for decades and centuries and thousands of years. We can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. And from this, we can see that this is not the end of the world. It's just the beginning of another. And perhaps because we're so connected as people today, as this pandemic has demonstrated, we have expanded capacity to think in terms of community rather than just thinking about ourselves. There's great power in realizing this, for it is at the local level where we live that we have the most power to effect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. And to that end, the UN is calling for a restoration imperative. And such an imperative goes beyond the environment. It would demand that we first restore local identity and humanity's sense of place and connection. It demands we restore truth, restore responsibility to human dignity, economic morality and equality, and in so doing, restore common purpose and a vision for the future of humanity and the planet. But most urgently, such an imperative must become an immediately effective vehicle for not just the protection, but for the rapid restoration of critical natural system function so that we can restore balance in the world and step back from the climate crisis. We're at a crossroads and we're running out of time. We need to get on top of this pandemic and get ahead of climate disruption before it gets too far ahead of us. We live in one of the places in the world where we can still do that. But to create and have hope, we all need to work together, all of us. And what we need urgently now is a second, new, and very different enlightenment. But no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. And it's perhaps worth reminding ourselves that humanity's first renaissance was born in Italy following an epidemic of the Black Plague in the 14th century. So maybe this is time, the time for another. We, all of us, need to be that next renaissance, to be that new and wiser beginning. And at the heart of that renaissance should be a revival of appreciation of one another, respect for deep ecological knowing accrued over time, and an intergenerational cultivation of an abiding sense of place, founded in part on a firm unwillingness to become divided over climate or any other global threat. Clearly, a better world is possible. No one is too young or too old to be part of this renaissance. I'm not, you're not, all are invited. So let that renaissance begin here, now, on this, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bob. That was very inspiring. And I loved how you said, stop being one person and that we can make the future together. That's very powerful. We have a number of questions and I'll endeavor to get to them all. So let me get through to these questions and we'll move through those. So thank you, Bob. That was really great. This is from Jack. There will be tremendous pressure on governments to restore the economy post-COVID, especially to implement shovel-ready projects, which may well increase carbon emissions and degrade environments. Is it reasonable to ask governments to stick to their carbon reduction targets under such circumstances?
I think there's an opportunity here because clearly there's going to be a great deal of money spent on stimulus. And there is an infrastructure deficit in Canada and many countries in which that stimulus funding can help a great deal. But I think it's really important now to recognize that we are at a moment where we can direct where that stimulus goes and what the results are. And we should be taking into account the fact that natural system restoration does form infrastructure and can, in concert with engineered or hard engineering solutions, help communities with water supply, water quality, and improvements in quality way of life. And I look at Gibson, British Columbia as a good example of that. Also, it would be valuable and very wise if some of the stimulus funding went into reversing eutrophication or the algal bloom formations in so many of Canada's important water bodies and water courses. Also, I think that it would be very valuable if stimulus money went into restorative agriculture to help us and help agriculture move toward being more sustainable. And also, I think, again, the most important thing perhaps is to invest in a just transition to new energy sources and to help those people in the fossil fuel sector that will need help in making that transition. And finally, in imagining stimulus spending, it would be helpful for all countries, including Canada, to keep in mind that we are a signatory to UN conventions and that the Sustainable Development Goals are a blueprint for us to create a better future.
Great, thank you. There's another one here. Marilyn asks, as an Albertan, you will be keenly aware of the double whammy of the economic impacts of COVID on goods and services, as well as the catastrophic fall in oil prices. Yet the federal government raised carbon taxes to $30 on April 1st. Should this increase have been deferred?
Well, these are complicated problems, and I can see the concern behind that question. And but the fact of the matter is that we could see all of this happening and haven't responded very well up until now. So what I would suggest to you is that history is going to judge fossil fuel company executives for what decisions they made. But if we're going to have a just transition, we have to help that sector and their workers. And that's probably the point. We have to remember that the millions of fossil fuel workers around the world who spent their lives building the energy economy that generated our current prosperity are also victims of climate change. They too deserve to be treated with dignity, and their story is part of the struggle for climate justice. And I'm reminded of a man named Ken Smith. Ken is a heavy equipment operator and president of Unifor Local 707A, which protects the interests of 3,500 Suncor oil sands workers in Fort McMurray. And in December of 2015, Ken was invited to the UN Climate Summit in Paris. And in listening to the panel discussion about clean energy job creation, he found it very unacceptable that workers like him were being so universally demonized as climate change deniers. And his point was this: he recognizes that a lot of people in the industry know that climate change is real. They get it, he said. They want to see perhaps the end of this and clean transition to other energy sources, but they don't want to be left holding the bag when it happens. And enormous wealth has been generated by this sector, and enormous advances in our society have come about because of it. But I think it's really important to give full consideration, broader consideration beyond single questions about where we're going to go with this as a society, because now is the moment where we have to make a decision about how our future is going to look.
Well said. Okay, Michael asks, the federal government has just announced some $1.7 billion to bail out industry to clean up orphan sites for defunct oil and gas wells. What happened to the polluter pay policy? Will this move simply encourage other industries to walk away from their environmental responsibilities?
Well, one has to ask, well, first of all, the numbers I'm getting are just unbelievable. There's 95,000 inactive wells. There's 34, okay, I get that. There's 3,400 orphan wells, okay. There's 73,000 abandoned wells. Are you kidding? Where was the regulatory body responsible for that as that number grew so spectacularly? And this is what I'm saying, is that we can no longer afford to have laws in place that are meaningless, and we can no longer continue if we want to have a safe environment, and if we want to have any chance of bringing climate change within the orbit of our influence and reduction, then we've got to be serious about these things, and we can't allow sectors just to act as they wish, and we have to start really recognizing what's happening to us out there and make judgments on them.
Cheryl asks, the COVID experience placed the spotlight on scientific-based policy making. Yet politicians have consistently disregarded the best scientific advice regarding climate change and biodiversity loss. Do you think science will come to the forefront post-COVID in shaping environmental policies?
That's a really good question, and I think it's really interesting to see what's happening now. I mean, you're seeing in real time, for example, in the United States, this division between those who believe in the science, medical science in this particular case, and those who don't have faith in and look to scientific evidence in their policy making and decision making. And we're going to see which avenue is going to bring us to the best possible outcome. And we've seen this with climate change, and we see it with many other areas where politics and money have superseded intelligence and evidence. And that's what gets you into trouble. And that's why we're in the situation we're in now. And if we don't change that, then we're just going to have recurring situations and more crises, and we'll end up in the permanent emergency that some politicians like to operate in, where they have almost complete control and other things happen that are untoward in terms of what kind of future we would like to have for our children and grandchildren.
That leads perfectly to the next question from Douglas. Our kids and grandkids are screaming. How can we elevate their actions in our political systems?
Prior to the pandemic, the youth voice was becoming extraordinarily powerful around the world. I mean, Greta Thunberg is on the front cover of Time, and there were demonstrations widely around the world. And one of the things that John O'Riordan and I discovered was the absolute intelligence and forthrightness of this youth movement. And what we found is a lot of these young people are very, very well informed scientifically. This, however, pandemic will slow all of this, and that's why, in many ways, the pandemic is not a good thing for the climate solutions direction that we need to go. But young people still have, in my mind, the most important role to play in establishing the future and the world we want. They're going to live in it. Also, even though they're not experienced and maybe they don't have all the knowledge, they have clear insight and clear sight. And they can look at the world and they can decide for themselves what they see before their very eyes. And they're not quite so willing to accept the status quo and the excuses for having arrived at that status quo that they're being offered. My great hope is in those young people.
Another question from Kathy. Jason Kenney has urged the oil and gas industry to not pay municipal taxes. Is this not illegal, especially for a politician to advocate? He has also declared war on anyone not supporting the industry with his $30 billion war room. How can we vote in leaders who will be responsible to its citizens and the public good?
I think it requires an order of magnitude more fierce citizenship. We need to participate more in understanding what the issues are. And we also have to speak up so that the platforms and the issues that are put forward as central to electing governments aren't defined by special interests, and that there are things that we need said and need done to make a better world that come to dominate those agendas. And in terms of the legality of matters like that, you're going to see more of that sort of thing. And again, this is why I am deeply troubled about the state of our democracy and how democratic process and common good can be hijacked so easily. And again, this movement toward trying to incite divisiveness as a means for keeping people on an urgent path and angry. This is not what we need. We need to find solutions, not find ways to divide us further. And I think we need to be looking at politicians and looking at ourselves and deciding how we can participate more effectively, more fiercely, more articulately, more passionately in creating the kind of political circumstances that we want. And I think this hiatus, this slowdown, this great pause gives us time to sit and think about what's happening and to evaluate, as that the questioner did, what is satisfying for us and what we think is good, not just in the immediate term for some, but in the immediate, mid and long term for all.
This one's from Guy Dauncey, who will be our Tuesday presenter. Guy will be presenting on a new ecological civilization from 11 to 12:30 this Tuesday, and you must tune in. Guy's amazing. So his question is, your first big recommended change is a new economic model. What do you think are its key ingredients? What would distinguish it from the current economy?
One of the major things, and I'm looking forward to Guy's webinar also. See, I know he has lots of ideas on this, but in my view, the first thing is that we've got to recognize that gross domestic product is not a good measure of what's happening, especially in contemporary economics, where it's so absolutely easy to pass on damages to future generations by not accounting for externalities in our economic system and our economic transactions. And one of the things that's really interesting about our Global Reset project is that we have some very interesting people looking at how we can express that as we get through this summer, so that we can make a good case for the kinds of transformations that need to be made. But it's clear that two things that are really in trouble here is this idea of absolutely relentless permanent growth. And the second thing is that we don't have to account for the damage that economic activities ultimately causes to individuals and to communities and to nations, but ultimately to the system itself. And I'm sure that Guy will have much to say on that, but those are the two things that I think are most important from immediate term perspective. It just can't go on like this.
Right. Okay, we're just going to take a few more questions, then we're going to do a quick poll. But first, thank you so much for the discussion. You mentioned eliminating wet markets, but my understanding is that animal agriculture in general is the leading cause in climate change. As individuals, is eliminating all animal products from our diet something that you encourage, as the IPCC report does?
That's a question we get all the time. And one of the things that's really important is that individuals can make choices as to whether or not they want to have meat as part of their diet, and in so doing make that contribution. But really the way free markets go, and also the way things are set up now, I mean, with the huge investments in the status quo, it's going to take time to make a transition like that, and it will be up to people to make that choice. And also, if enough people do it, then you can see it happen. I think any democratic government would be very hard pressed to tell the livestock industry in their own country that it shouldn't exist. And if there's going to be any adjustment to that, it has to be through a transition in terms of demand. Also, there's some places where the link, and particularly in many developing countries, where there is a link between having livestock and subsistence farming that can't be ignored. And so the key point here, I suppose, is that, I mean, the amount of livestock that we've got on Earth is an enormous number, and it does cause considerable impact. The question is perfectly valid. I don't think you can do that by universal fiat, and I think you have to handle that with great care, and much has to be really left up to the individual to fashion that demand by example and by teaching others what that actually means in terms of reducing climate impacts and greenhouse gas footprints.
Ted Sheldon has said, Bob, well done. You referenced a broad collaboration towards the end of your presentation. Is the UN amassing or reconfirming other key international partners in order for us to move globally together towards the just transition that you just articulated?
I think it's really important to recognize the extraordinary stress the UN is under right now. I mean, that the United States would say, for example, it will refuse to fund the World Health Organization. Is a very, very problematic thing. We also have 31 other agencies that are underfunded and that are having to struggle right now, even when they're heavily needed in a time like this. So the UN itself is under siege. And I don't mind telling you, even the UN university to which I belong, our future is uncertain beyond this year because of the funding crisis, and also the fact that so much money will be invested otherwise. That money might come from multilateral organizations, support for multilateral organizations like the UN. So I think the most important thing that we can rely on right now, and the look to from the UN as an example, is the established work that's been done on the Sustainable Development Goals. One thing that, and I did this in my PowerPoint, and I should have maybe explained this, but one of our problems is we put forward the Sustainable Development Goals like a periodic table, and when in fact it should be a circle like this pin, because they all relate to one another, and one actually informs the other. And if we could have more nations and more people in effective positions in a broader range of countries understand that is actually a blueprint to get us through this. And it's iterative too. We go around that circle and we improve things. We find out where some of our our focuses were not right, where they can be refined. And it's iterative in that way, but it's a truly useful blueprint for what we're trying to do here in terms of global reset and the future of hope.
This last one is from Trevor Hancock, who is our Saturday presenter next week. To make this work, we need to partner with the unusual suspects. Who do you see as some of them, especially in the business sector? In addition to hope, what are the opportunities you see for these new businesses?
I think there is absolutely enormous business opportunity in rehabilitation and restoration. And I think that we can find cheaper ways to provide the services that a society needs through natural processes if we investigate those more. And I think there are, if you look at what's happened here now, what this pandemic has done, it's put into relief a whole range of businesses that are probably in serious threat in the future, including the universities as we know them, because more classes will be online. Businesses are going to be altered completely by this. More people will be working at home. There'll be less need for infrastructure, less need for cars and driving. There's a whole range of new business opportunities, service businesses that are going to emerge out of this that we haven't imagined yet. And in a sense, that's where the opportunity resides. Again, as I said, I quote the Africans all the time, the future belongs to those who create it and think about it and bring it into existence. So there are going to be a lot of changes. There's going to be a lot of things that are established institutions that will have to be altered dramatically. And there's going to be new business opportunities. There's going to be new career opportunities. And again, speaking back to young people, there are going to be opportunities for them that they imagine that don't exist now, but that they bring into existence through their own imagination and by virtue of the world that they want to create for themselves.
Well said. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to do a quick poll. There's just for a little fun, just to kind of go on to the next little bit. There's 3 questions here, and there is a scroll bar to your right. So when you're finished answering the first one, you can scroll to the second and the third, and then we'll post the results. And it's really quite straightforward. First one is, where do you think climate leadership most needs to come from? Pick the one that you think most resonates with you. Number 2, do you think the post-COVID-19 experience will lead to improvements in the global response to the climate crisis? Yes or no? And do you feel more optimistic about the future at this time? Poll is closed now. Where do you think climate leadership most needs to come from? Well, 33% said individuals and 50% say government. Do you think the post-COVID-19 experience will lead to climate improvements? Yes, good. And do you feel more optimistic about the future at this time? Yes, good. This is great. I would like to introduce John Reardon. He's our Climate in the Arts partner, and he will provide a quick summary of what we just heard. And John, by the way, was referenced in this talk by Bob. You heard his name a few times. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Environment, and he co-authored 2 books with Bob Sandford. And he's also one of the reasons why the Great Bear Rainforest enjoys a measure of protection. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Frances. Well, Bob has provided an excellent overview of the need for transformation in society to deal with the oncoming climate and biodiversity crisis. So I want to reflect on 3 aspects of this transformation. The first is what has happened in the 50 years since the first Earth Day, what's been good and what's been bad, somewhat reflective of Bob's comments. The second is what other transformations have taken place from other crises in the world over the centuries. And the third is what can we learn from our activities on dealing with COVID-19 with how we want to deal with the climate and biodiversity crisis. So moving to Earth Day and 50 years ago, there's been a lot of remarkable transformations in the last 50 years, good for society. One is the food revolution, with a tremendous increase in agricultural production, which then allowed us to feed largely 7 billion people who are alive on the earth right now. Secondly, there's been major improvements to public health, which has increased the life expectancy around the world and decreased child mortality significantly. Thirdly, there's been major strides in dealing with world poverty, especially in developing countries. And fourthly, huge improvements in global technology, particularly recently in digital technology. But all of these developments have come at the price that Bob talked about. One is an huge increase in fossil fuel-based energy production, and that's leading to an accumulation of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, as shown in Bob's presentation, and also the acidification of our oceans, to the impact on coral reefs and fish resources. Also, the major changes in biodiversity is being created by loss of forests, by loss of wetlands, changes to our soils, and urbanization. And finally, globalization has shown that we are very much more vulnerable to pandemics now than we were a few years ago, particularly back in the Spanish flu of a century ago. So secondly, some of the major crises of the last few centuries have led to really revolutionary transformations. It makes me feel that we can learn something from COVID-19. The Renaissance in the 1500s largely was a result of the Black Death in the mid-1300s, and it created the rise of global trading in seafaring nations, the end of the old feudal era and a slightly more equality society, blossoming of arts and culture around the world, and of course the reformation of the church. So these were large-scale changes caused by the Reformation. World War I was a crisis, and as a result of that, we all started paying income tax. Sure, that's a good thing, but it's changed the way we govern ourselves. And finally, World War II was the result of that led to universal healthcare in most of the Western world and in Europe. So going to the more specific relationships between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, Bob has talked strongly for the need for the Earth to become a safe and just place. So safe means that we live within the planetary boundaries that he talked about. As he pointed out, we've already exceeded 4 of them. We have to retreat on these 4 and live within all 9 or 10 that require us to be safe. And secondly, to be just, which means we have to complete the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the UN for transforming our society. So in terms of that, I think there are a number of lessons that we can learn specifically from the COVID experience that will equip us well for dealing with the climate biodiversity crisis. So I'm going to coin the term that carbon is the new COVID. So in terms of science, we've seen in the last 6 months the importance of public health scientists giving us information about shaping policy and how we would both manage the pandemic during the crisis and come out of it as we find a vaccine. I realize it's a little more complicated looking at science for dealing with the climate crisis, but it would be nice that the science was given a higher profile, as Bob has recommended, in the management of that climate crisis over the next 30 years. Secondly, basic income. You know, we in Canada, like many countries around the world, have brought in a Canadian emergency response benefit, which is a way of providing funding for people who have lost their jobs. And I think there'll be a fair bit of discussion going forward about whether or not we need some form of universal basic income for a more equitable society. Third, we've heard a lot of discussion about flattening the curve. That has been to deal with the pandemic curve and the need to manage our hospitalizations and not overwhelm our medical system. That's caused by, created by safe distancing, staying at home and washing our hands. But the curve that we now have to flatten is the carbon curve. And we could see from Bob's presentation, that's unfortunately still on the rise. And we have to find ways of flattening that, just as we've done with the COVID curve. Fourthly, the vaccine. Clearly a vaccine is possible, and once it's created, will create a solution to this pandemic, although we may be faced with other pandemics going forward. But the vaccine in the context of climate and biodiversity is that we become carbon neutral by mid-century. So that means that we don't emit any more carbon than we can absorb either by natural processes in the earth or by engineered processes. But we've only got 30 years to become carbon neutral, and that's a long-term vaccine for dealing with climate and biodiversity. And finally, monitoring. We've heard a lot about the importance of testing and contact tracing in the pandemic after we start to come out of this crisis. And likewise, we need to have a way of measuring our carbon footprints. And I like the idea of a carbon card, like a credit card, except the currency would not be money, it would be carbon. And every time we made a purchase, the carbon would be identified, and we could then voluntarily find ways to reduce our carbon footprint, maybe 10% every 5 years until we became all carbon neutral by 2050. So there's many lessons that we're going to learn from this, and we're going to explore these over the next week under the EarthFest series, and on the longer term, another series that we're beginning to put mind to. But unfortunately, nature is not taking a pause with this climate crisis, so we have to continue to be vigilant about tracking nature. But more importantly, society has demonstrated that it can come together and put more emphasis on the collective good than on an individual. And I've been very heartened by what has happened in the last month, that we've been able to come together as a society and recognize that our collective responsibility is more important than our individual self-worth. So I hope we can continue that, because that's a key to dealing with the long-term climate crisis. I have the great pleasure here of starting a program called Climate and the Arts. And I did this in the name of my dear wife, Gail, who fortunately passed away a year or so ago. But she was both a musician and a climate advocate for more action on the climate front. And so we've created a series that combines climate stories with performing arts. And Bob has demonstrated some wonderful climate stories over the last hour. And now it's a time to bring in the arts. So we've invited Brian Yoon, who is the principal cellist with the Victoria Symphony Orchestra, to play for us some music. It's very important to me to hear this because Gail was a member of the cello section for 30 years in the Victoria Symphony and played under Brian's leadership in the last few years when he became principal. So Brian will be performing Bach's Sarabande from his third suite for solo cello.
Bravo! Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone, for listening today.